Ethnography includes both participant observation and interviewing. And participant observation is where you are observing the interactions of other people, where interviewing, you're more directly asking them about their experiences. And there are different types of interviews that you conduct in research. There can be very informal interviews, which are not audio recorded, which may even be spontaneous. For example, you may be doing some participant observation and you have some questions, and so you look to somebody and you ask them several things. I know that my husband did participant observation with an urban search and rescue training, and he went and did swiftwater rescue and structural collapse training. And during the course of events, he was observing, he was participating in the training too, but he had questions for people, and he might turn and end up talking to someone for 30 minutes, but it wasn't what you would call a structured interview. It was very informal, but it gave him key information. So interviewing can be very structured, it can be semi-structured, it can be completely unstructured depending. But most of the time, when you plan for a research interview, it's going to be a structured to semi-structured interview in which you have an interview guide or interview schedule that you prepare in advance with a set of questions that have been approved by an institutional review board. And most of the time you want to audio record the interview because it's very difficult to recall specifics that people said afterwards. And so you want to create a transcript afterwards. The types of questions that you develop are things like non-directive questions, which are more about getting someone to open-endedly explain their experiences. You have grand tour questions and mini tour questions. Like grand tour questions are things like, I want to know more about your life. I want to know very general, can you tell me your story? Where are you from? Just take me through your entire life. And golly, it's very general. But mini tour questions, okay, that's too much. Can you tell me about your childhood, specifically about when you entered grade school? What was that like for you? What were your experiences like when you started grade school? So you can go from grand tour to mini tour questions. You can go from example and experience questions, which probe deeper as well. Example questions, can you give me an example of when that happened to you? Do you have an experience that stands out in your mind related to that? When I am asking my group of participants about their breastfeeding experiences, I have oftentimes had to say, you're telling me about how you had some difficulties related to latch on. Can you give me an example of exactly when that happened and what you did to overcome it? Also, you have follow-up questions, and follow-up questions help you to gather more information, of course, but they also help you to pose ideal situations so that you get the person to talk more about what their hopes, their ideals are. And then you also have what we call native language questions, which gets them to clarify what they mean by certain terms, because there's certain terms that they're using that are native to their culture sharing group. You have directive questions, which are a little bit less open-ended. There's still an opportunity for more free response. There are structural questions that get at how we organize experience, how we prioritize experience. So you might ask, for example, I might ask someone who's talking about their breastfeeding experiences and how they made choices in regard to infant feeding, and they tell me about their family, and they tell me about what they read ahead of time. And I might say, well, what was more important to you? The advice you got from physicians, what you read, your family? Could you try to prioritize that for me and tell me what order you got that information? And that would be more of a structural question. You also engage in compare and contrast questions, which help you to see the similarities and differences between the experiences that people are talking about. And so, for example, in breastfeeding questions, I often ask people, can you tell me the similarities and differences between breastfeeding in public versus breastfeeding in your home? There are also emergent idea questions where you present a tentative claim and then you ask them for their viewpoint on the claim. A good example of this from my own research is I normally say, well, the National Breastfeeding Campaign and a lot of medical organizations have said breast is best. How do you feel about that claim? What do you think about that claim? When you hear it, what's your point of view on it? Then there's also devil's advocate questions where you kind of get them to talk about, okay, now you told me a lot about this issue, but try to argue against it, or tell me a different point of view on it. Then you can also ask closing questions. These are sort of sensitive questions which you might pose at the end because you want to build rapport with them first. Or there may be sort of loose ends questions that you just need to get wrapped up before you close out the interview. Conducting the interview can be kind of tricky. You have to get comfortable with it, and it can be very uncomfortable at first. First, you need to gain consent. You have an ethical obligation to gain consent to audio record the interview and to ask them questions. You also have to inform them that at any point in time where they feel uncomfortable or they want to stop the interview, they have the right to do so. Some people don't understand that they have that right. They feel like because they said at first that they want to do the interview that they have to finish it, but that's not the case. Also, you want to set the tone for the interview by explaining the basic reasons why you're going about the interview, and you also want to make sure that you explain how there may be some benefit to them by doing the interview, benefit to you by doing the interview. You're building rapport through your communication with them by having reciprocal self-disclosures, and it might be, for example, in my interviews about infant feeding, I have 2 children, and so in the interview, someone might ask me a question, or I might, in order to prompt them, I might say, well, this is kind of what I experienced. Did you experience something similar, different? Can you tell me about your experiences? And so it makes them feel more comfortable when you disclose as well. You want some sort of interview guide or script that's going to help to direct you in the interview, but you still want to be very flexible, which means you have to know that interview guide and script ahead of time. Basically have it memorized, be able to adapt, be able to listen actively, adjust questions to the flow of the interview, ask follow-up questions, provide feedback, be very flexible, which means you have to really listen to what they're saying. And you have to use perception checking through the process to make sure that you're not perceiving them in a way that's completely opposite of the way that they intend. Then finally, you have to transcribe the interviews, which is incredibly time intensive. Listening becomes so important, and you not only have to listen to every word when you transcribe, you have to listen to the overall sentence, and sometimes it can be difficult to, even when you're listening back to an audio recording, hear what they said, and so that can be a very challenging experience.